Hello, bruv. We're back with grandmother's stories. The stories of Emily Ward, as told by Frances Hurlbut. We go to New Salem. After my mother died, father did not know which way to turn. He had loved her dearly, and it seemed to take from his life all there was of value. Uncle Sam wrote to father from New Salem, Ohio, a little town on Lake Erie, now called Conneaut. I don't know how you say that. Probably should learn it. Telling him he must not take his motherless little children to such a far-off country as Kentucky, where we had no relatives to help him look after them, but to come to him, and he and his wife would help him take care of them until he could get settled. So we turned our course and went to Erie by land, and there we took a boat and went the rest of the way by water. Taking a boat at that time and on Lake Erie didn't mean getting on board a pretty steamer with handsome saloons and comfortable staterooms, but it meant a big, open sailboat, something like the fishing boats they have at Mackinac now. One rather rugged, squally day in April, we children and the household goods were snugly packed away in such a boat, and father and the man who owned it were to sail it. It seemed to me a very different thing from what I had expected in the sail down the various rivers to Cincinnati. Mother was gone never to return. To heaven, they said, but where was heaven? We did not know, but we did know that we were left alone with father, who had always been away from home so much that we didn't feel well acquainted with him, and that we had no mother to care for us, to direct us, and to love us. I felt that my own responsibility for the younger children was great, and I tried to do everything for them that mother had usually done. I know this particular morning we sat very still and quiet, not talking even to each other. And father had been so occupied in his various duties that he had only paid us the necessary attention of seeing us safe in the boat. We had sailed. Don't look at this numbers. I don't know who they are. Don't call those people. They were stuck inside a book. I don't know who they are. Don't call them, please. We had sailed for some time when we stopped, and father and the man hauled the book up on the beach, unloaded the goods, and helped us children out. Then they got back, pushed off, pulled up the sails, and made off. We watched them for a while in silent amazement, but as father neither spoke nor even looked back where we were, and the boat kept sailing on and on, we looked at each other and burst into tears. Oh, sobbed Abba, the youngest child, mother is dead and father is gone and left us to starve, and there is no one to take care of us. And she threw herself on the ground and cried aloud with grief and terror. Sally did about the same thing. But though Eber and I cried too, for we thought father had gone and left us to die, we also had to think. After the first transports of grief were over, we began to plan what we should do. Eber said he wouldn't die there. He'd walk up to New Salem, and Uncle Sam would take care of him. And he'd take us too. He wasn't afraid of bears. He'd carry Abba half the way, and I could carry her the other half. And as for Miss Sally, he said with a merry twinkle in his eye, she could just walk herself. I can see him now, said Grandma, a short, stout boy of only 6 years, but with the pluck of a man. I agreed to what he said, and while we were in the midst of our plans for the journey and trying to soothe Sally and Abba, lo and behold, there was the boat, and father and the man were already hauling it up on the beach. We wiped the tears from our faces so quickly as we could, but even father's preoccupied eyes could see that something unusual had happened. Well, my little children, he said, what is the matter? Why have you been crying? The revulsion of feeling was too much for us, and we all began to cry again. And with a voice broken by sobs, Abba told him that we thought our mother was dead, and that our father had gone and left us to starve. My poor children, he said, while tears rolled down his face. How could you think so? I suppose you know what we intended to do. I supposed you knew what we intended to do. The harbor of Area is protected on one side by a long, narrow strip of land that runs quite a distance out into the lake, and as that day the water was very rough, Father thought he would leave us children in the baggage while he took the boat around the point of land, come up on the other side, take us on board again, and so save us from being seasick in the high waves that were running farther out. After he had explained it to us, we felt a good deal ashamed that we had thought so hardly of our father, who had always been good to us. We didn't go far that day. The wind blew very hard offshore, and the waves kept growing higher and higher, so that in spite of all care, one would every now and then dash over the boat. The clouds too grew heavier and blacker, and it began to rain, so that we had to go on shore. It was not an easy thing to get the boat on the beach without swamping it. With the wind and the water both trying to toss it 100 different ways, we children sat in silence, nestled close together towards the forward part of the boat, watching with the keenest interest the wild play of the waves and the winds and the clouds. Once in a while, Abba would dive her head into my lap to shut out the scene that terrified her, but Eber sat with his hands in his pockets, perfectly calm and apparently enjoying everything. Sometimes, when a towering wave would seem to be threatening the swamp boat and crew and passengers, he would look a little keener-eyed than usual, and as the boat would rise upon the wave of a long-drawn sigh, would be all the I can't read. And as the boat would rise upon the wave, a long-drawn sigh would be all the evidence of excited feeling he would give. Sally clung to me in silent terror, and as for myself, I didn't have any time to be afraid. I was thinking so much of soothing the fears of Sally and Abba. We got ashore safe enough, but wet to the skin. The boat was pulled up on dry land and turned bottom up so as to protect the household stuff from the rain that was now coming down in torrents. And we children and father and the man crawled under it too, until the rain should stop, when they would fix a camp. For there was no getting out of the place for that day, and perhaps not the next. When the rain ceased to pour and had become a light drizzle, father and the man took their axes and began to make preparations to build a camp. We stayed under the boat and looked out to see what was going on. The man collected the wood for a big fire. First, a great log from a tree that had been dead so long it was dry. That was for a backlog. Then pieces of wood and dry branches were piled around it and on top of it until it made a huge pile. When it was ready to light, I suppose you children think he took a matchbox from his pocket, got out a match, struck it, and in a minute there was a fire. Here the children looked as if they thought, of course that was the way it was. That was the way of it. But Grandma shook her head and said, no, indeed. There had never been a match made in those days. But what he did do was to take out of his pocket a tinder box, a flint, and a knife. He opened the tinder box, and with the knife he struck the flint until a spark of fire went down into the box and set the tinder on fire. Then a piece of paper, properly folded, was lighted, and that lighted a piece of dry wood, and with that the whole pile was soon in a fine blaze, crackling and snapping and throwing out great sparks. In the meantime, father had put up a shed-like tent, which opened to the fire, where we were to sleep, and when he and the man started out to gather evergreen twigs, we children slipped out from under the boat and ran to help them, for by this time the rain was over. We filled our arms with the fragrant boughs many times and carried them to the tent. And then, when there was enough, we helped father make a big bed. That would be a funny bed, said Golden Hair. How did you make it? We began at the foot and put down a layer of twigs with their stems toward the head, then another layer put the same way. The leafy parts covered the stem ends of the first one, and so on up to the head, finishing it off there with a lot of small soft twigs that did good service for pillows. When it was done, it was big enough for us all, and was a very much softer and nicer bed than you would imagine. Here the children nodded their little heads and smiled, and Porty said he wished he could sleep in such a bed all the time. When it came bedtime, we lay with our feet to the fire, first Sally and Abba on each side of me, then Eber and father, and on the outside the man. We were covered with blankets and slept as sound as you do now in bed, and very much sounder than I do. We stayed there a week before the storm abated and the waves of wind died down enough to launch the boat. Sometimes father and the man would go out hunting and bring in squirrels and other small game. It amused us children very much to see men cooking. I wanted to help them, but they wouldn't let me do very much, and I wasn't used to cooking outdoors. The children looked as if they wished they'd been there to have all that fun, and Grandma said, "Of course, there are a good many drawbacks about camping out in the woods in April, when the wind is blowing cold and it rains every day." There were no leaves on the trees, and there were no flowers, and the grass had not begun to grow, but luckily little children can have a good time without almost anywhere, if only those who are with them are kind to them. Fathers and mothers in those days, though just as good as they are now, didn't pet and play with their children as they do now. The old rule that children should be seen and not heard was in full force, and they felt great respect and awe for their parents. I think it made better children, but I don't know. I guess they were not so happy, and Grandma looked thoughtfully at the bright faces of the children and said softly, "But it made us older for our years." Porty said he was glad he didn't have to keep still and just be looked at, and that made them all laugh. The sail from the camp to New Salem, about 30 miles, was accomplished in a day, and with no further incidents. We were received very kindly by Uncle Sam and his wife, and they did all they could to make us comfortable. I washed the children and put clean clothes on them and myself. It seemed good to be clean and in a dry house, to sleep in a good bed and eat at a table, and to stay in one place for a while after our 4 months' wanderings. Goodbye.